What is going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, the Indian superstar Arjun Erigaisi is facing off against the World Championship challenger Gukesh D in one of the craziest attacking games you will ever see in the 2023 Tata Steel India Blitz Tournament. And here we go. In the game, Arjun Erigaisi opens 1e4, best by test, and Gukesh D goes 1c5, the Sicilian Defense. He's in a fighting mood this game. Now, knight f3 following the main line for Arjun, and e6 for Gukesh, then d4, the open Sicilian on the board. Now we have c takes, knight takes, and which Sicilian line is Gukesh going to go for? In the game, he does go for the Taimanov variation with the move knight c6, and this variation has become much more popular at the highest levels lately. Now here Arjun, he follows the main line, knight to c3, then queen c7, and then bishop e3, potentially going for an English attack with the moves queen d2 and long castles. Now here, Gukesh D, what's it going to be? Well, the main line starts with a6, that is the classical Taimanov move. Instead, he does go knight to f6, heading for some sort of hybrid between the four knights variation and the Taimanov Sicilian. Now, this line is thought to be a little bit weaker, as white can go f4, queen to f3, and then long castles, and that line is very good for him. However, instead, in the game, Arjun Erigaisi, he is sticking to his guns. He just goes f3, heading for an English attack. And now, if you are a beginner, the English attack is the line where you go queen d2, long castles, then start the attack on the king side with g4, h4, and g5. This line is very, very dangerous against many different lines of the Sicilian defense. Now here, Gukesh, how are you going to combat this very dangerous attacking idea by Arjun? Well, black has many different lines available here in this position and on the next few moves. For example, bishop e7, bishop b4, h5, knight to e5. All these moves are playable. Instead, Gukesh does play the typical Taimanov move a6. Now Arjun, queen d2, following the plan, long castles, then g4, g5, and starting the attack. And here Gukesh D, once again, he does play the typical Taimanov move, b5, gaining space on the queen side, threatening b4, setting up bishop b7 and rook c8, and overall he is going for it on the queen side, leaving his king side undeveloped for now. All right, Arjun Erigaisi, I would have thought either long castles here or knight takes c6. Whenever black does go b5 in the Taimanov, then knight takes c6 is a decent option, as b takes c6 taken back with the b pawn is no longer an option. However, instead of those two ideas, here Arjun, he's a madman. He goes for it on the king side immediately with the move g4, threatening g5, gaining space, and starting the attack even before he castles. All right, Gukesh D, what's it going to be? Once again, he has many different lines available here. For example, knight takes d4, bishop e7, bishop b4, even knight d5 are all playable. But in the game, he plays a very simple move, h6, clamping down on that g5 square and stopping g5 for now. Of course, g5 is still technically possible. However, after g5, h takes, then bishop takes, Gukesh will have the open h-file for the rook, and it will be much harder for Arjun Erigaisi to get the attack going on the king side. Typically, before g5, you do want to go rook g1, h4, and only then g5. That way you can recapture with the h-pawn, threatening g6 with the ongoing attack. Now here, Arjun Erigaisi, long castles on the board. And now Gukesh, what's it going to be? Once again, you have a million different options. Bishop e7, b4, knight takes d4. In the game, though, he goes knight to e5. And this is a very interesting idea. First of all, the most obvious point of this move, knight takes c6, is no longer a possibility. The knight jumping off the c6 square, therefore knight takes c6 isn't even a legal move. Beyond that, you are setting up bishop e7, b4, rook c8 ideas, basically starting the attack right away on the queen side, ignoring the development of your king side again, and this turns out to be a very strong idea here. Now Arjun Erigaisi, he's no dummy, he finds the right response. You cannot defend on the queen side, instead you must attack on the king side immediately. And he starts with the move h4, gaining space, potentially threatening g5 after, say, rook g1 or even rook to h3. The rook must be defended on h1 before you can go g5 and take back with the h-pawn. If he does that too fast, g5, h takes would lose the rook on h1 to rook takes h1, so that rook on h1 must be defended first. All right, here, Gukesh D, he goes for it on the queen side, b4 on the board, gaining space and knocking back that knight off the c3 square. And real fast, I do want to point out, in this position, this is very similar to an English attack against the Najdorf, the main difference being Gukesh has not gone d6 yet. In the Najdorf, d6 is typically played right away, However, here with that pawn on the d7 square instead of d6, Gukesh has saved a tempo, and he can in the future go d5 in one move. And that means he is basically up a full tempo versus the English attack against the knight or Sicilian. And for that reason, the game here on move 11 is already roughly balanced, as you can see. All right, here, where is the knight supposed to go? Well, the typical squares in the English attack are going to be a4 and e2. However, in the game, Arjun Erigaisi did go knight to b1, and this turns out to be a very big inaccuracy. That knight is cut off from the game on the b1 square. Again, knight to a4 was the key idea in this position. And now here, Gukesh, he makes full use of the fact that that d7 pawn is still on d7 instead of d6, and here he advances d5 in one go, not going d6 then d5. All right, Arjun Erigaisi, what should he be doing here? Well, first of all, the threat is D takes e4, sorry. D takes e4 is the threat. Then if you recapture with the pawn, knight takes e4 does win a pawn. So Arjun Erigaisi is at risk of being down a pawn. What's the response going to be? Well, first of all, you can take on d5. However, after e takes, then knight takes d5. Again, Gukesh is in control. Instead of that here, he does go g5, expanding on the king side immediately, trying to push back that knight off f6. However, the drawback of this move is the rook on h1 is undefended, and that means after h takes g5 from Gukesh, here you cannot go h takes g5, recapturing with the pawn, as then the rook on h1 would hang. Again, you got to go rook h3 or rook g1 before that idea is relevant. So instead here, bishop takes g5 is the move. You are technically now threatening bishop takes f6. However, this is not the ideal attacking setup in this line for white. All right, here, Gukesh. The move is bishop b7, developing the bishop on b7 all along diagonal and putting more pressure on that pawn on e4. Of course, taking on e4 immediately was possible, but then Arjun would have dangerous attacking ideas based on h5 and h6 immediately, simply ignoring the pawn on e4. So instead, bishop e7 on the board for Gukesh. Now here, Arjun, he does take on d5, a very logical choice. E takes d5, and now because the bishop is on b7, you can recapture with the bishop instead of the knight, and that is what Gukesh does here. So, bishop takes d5, putting a lot of pressure on this long diagonal here. Therefore, the best move for Arjun is going to be rook to h3, defending the f3 pawn. Knight takes f3 was a threat, but that is no longer the case. And beyond that, the rook is very active on the third rank. For example, you can imagine Arjun Erigaisi playing f4 in the future and then swinging the rook over along the third rank, defending on the queenside, or even just leaving it on h3, and it will defend these key squares here on the queenside once again. So very good move, rook to h3. Now here, in this position, that pawn on a2 is hanging. The question is Gukesh going to win the pawn right now, or is he going to avoid that and perhaps go rook c8, bishop d6, and so on, just developing his pieces? Well, in the game, Gukesh, he takes the pawn on a2, bishop takes a2 on the board. Gukesh is a very principled player. However, this move here in this position was not the strongest. And here's why. In this position here, Arjun Erigaisi, he can go for the attack, starting with the move f4. That would knock back the knight off the e5 square, and then once it moves, Arjun could go bishop g2, putting his bishop on this long diagonal, and that bishop would be very, very active, and Arjun would be back in the game. However, instead, Arjun plays a different idea, one that is very thematic for the English attack. He actually retreats the queen back to the e1 square, queen to e1 on the board, and this is a move that would make Magnus Carlsen himself blush. Magnus Carlsen just loves these weird retreating queen moves where you do move the queen back a square or two, back a file or two, while opening up new threats against the enemy, and that is what happens here. So, the queen on e1, it is lining up with the knight on e5, and beyond that, it is technically pinning that pawn on e6 to the king on e8, assuming the knight moves. So now, ideas like knight to f5 or f4 then f5 do come to mind, and that queen would be very well placed on the e-file. However, the problem with it is a little bit slow, and here Gukesh, he is in a good position to fight for the advantage once again. Alright, the best moves here for Gukesh include bishop c5, rook d8, and so on. However, he does go knight to g6 here, retreating the knight off the e5 square, getting out of the way of that f4 advance. However, this move for Gukesh himself is a little bit slow, and here Arjun, he turns up the heat. He immediately goes f4, and this is a pawn sacrifice. Here, black can take on f4 with the knight. That is a legal move, and Gukesh, believe it or not, he does take the pawn in the game. Knight takes f4, and by my count right now, Arjun Erigaisi is down 2 pawns. First of all, that pawn on a2, bishop takes a2, won that one. And then the second pawn, knight takes f4. However, Arjun Erigaisi, he is getting open lines against the black king. The king is stuck on the e8 square, and this is exactly the sort of position he wants for this blitz game. All right, from here, rook to f3, putting pressure on the knight. Now we see that both the rooks and the queen lining up on all these files against the black king. Now here, what should Gukesh be doing to defend? Well, the strongest idea is knight 4 d5, retreat the knight to the very good d5 square. However, even that move does fall prey to some insane tactics. The strongest move then, believe it or not, is knight takes e6, giving up the knight on the e6 square. Instead of that, here, Gukesh does go bishop d6, defending the knight with the bishop on d6. However, this move also has its flaws. Here, Arjun, knight to f5, jumping in with the knight, and that pawn on e6 is pinned by the queen to the king on e8. Therefore, e takes f5 is not a move, and Arjun making full use of the queen on the e1 square, opposing the black king. Now from here, bishop e5 on the board, Gukesh getting the bishop out of the attack of the rook, blocking the e-file, and piling up on the pawn on b2, so a very good multi-purpose move, but Arjun is not done. Here he finds yet another way to increase the pressure without slowing down. Alright, Chess YouTube, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to find the best continuation for Arjun Erigaisi. This one is not easy, so if you find it, hats off to you, my friend. And by the way, go ahead and smash that YouTube like button if you're enjoying this video and if you're a fan of Arjun Erigaisi and Gukesh. Thank you so much for doing that. Alright, here, Arjun. The best idea for him is going to be knight takes g7. And this is a risky move. It requires the most precise follow-up. The idea is the king has to move. You go to the f8 square with the king to f8. Then you fly in with the queen. Queen takes b4, winning this pawn. The idea being, after black takes the knight on g7, then you take the bishop or the knight on f4 with the bishop. Bishop takes f4, and the queen does control the f4 square, meaning you do win back the piece with the gain of the pawn on g7. So that would be the best continuation. But instead here, Arjun, he does go rook to e3, piling up pressure on the e-file, targeting the bishop on e5. However, this move turns out to be a little bit weaker. And here, instead of simply defending, Gukesh D, he goes rook to c8, ignoring the threat on the bishop. He knows if Arjun goes rook takes e5, then queen takes c2 will be checkmate on the spot. The audacity of Gukesh, threatening checkmate in one move and hanging the bishop. Alright, Arjun, he sees the threat. He goes rook d2, defending, a good move. But now, the knight on the f5 square, it is hanging. The bishop on e5 blocks the e-file, and here Gukesh takes the knight on f5. E takes f5 on the board. Of course, now the bishop still hangs. Rook takes e5, hits the king with check, and now Gukesh, knight to e6, blocking the check with the knight. Alright, in this position, Arjun, he has to find the right continuation to continue the attack. It turns out the strongest move here is bishop takes f6, at least according to the engine. You do trade the bishop for the knight, and you triple black's pawns on the f-file. That would not be a pretty sight for black. Instead here, Arjun does take the free pawn on a6. Bishop takes a6, winning the pawn, and putting pressure on the rook on c8. Now the rook has to move. Rook a8 on the board, then bishop b5, once again hitting the check. And finally, Gukesh, he has to resign the right to castle. So, king to f8 on the board. He can no longer castle on the king side, although that wasn't really an attractive option to begin with. Alright, here Arjun. Rook to d3 on the board, activating the rook on the third rank and covering the b3 square in the case of b3 ideas. Now, bishop takes b1 for Gukesh, king takes b1 for Arjun, and then knight to e4, jumping in with the knight and putting a lot of pressure on that bishop on g5. Not to mention the attack on the rook. Of course, the queen no longer defending the rook on e5. Gukesh being a tactical monster so far in this game. Of course, the pawn on b4 is hanging. Arjun takes it. Queen takes b4, wins the pawn. King to g8. And here Arjun Erigaisi has to keep the attack going, and he has to keep it going fast. So for that reason, in this position, you know what, Chess YouTube? Good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, pause the video and find the key idea for Arjun Erigaisi in this position to keep the attack going at full speed. Alright, I hope you found it. The key idea, of course, here Arjun, he sacrifices the rook. Rook takes e4, giving up the rook for the knight and the pawn. Rook takes, then pawn takes, then queen takes on the board. And of course, the rook is worth more than the knight and the pawn. However, Arjun, he had to do it to keep the attack going. That knight was just too strong on the e4 square. Now, rook to b8 for Gukesh, putting pressure on the bishop. Rook d5 defends the bishop, but the rook is very vulnerable on the d5 square. All right, knight takes g5, then rook takes. The other benefit of rook d5, you can recapture on g5 with the rook, and now the rook is lined up with the black king on g8. Now rook to h6. Gukesh with the rook lift of his own, threatening potentially rook b6 on the very next move, or even rook to e6, hitting the queen on e4. Now queen g4, piling up the pressure on g7, but Gukesh spots the threat. He goes g6. However, here Arjun, bishop c4, lining up pressure on this diagonal. And now, believe it or not, rook takes, then queen takes is a real threat, as the pawn on f7 would be pinned to the king on g8. All right, Gukesh, what's he going to do about that threat? Well, it turns out he ignores it. Queen b7 on the board. His idea being, once again, he has the audacity to threaten checkmate in one move. However, Arjun, he is not seeing ghosts, and he just takes on g6. Rook takes g6. The idea being, after rook takes, again, you recapture with the queen. Queen takes g6, hitting the king with check. Therefore, queen takes b2 is not a threat yet. So, king to f8. Queen d6, hit the king g7, and in this weird middle game endgame position, Arjun Erigaisi has the queen, the bishop, and 2 pawns versus the queen and rook of Gukesh, and believe it or not, the computer says we are dead even. Just look at the eval bar on the left and verify for yourself. This is going to be an all-out slugfest between these two Indian monsters for the rest of this game. All right, b3 defends that b2 point finally, then queen h1 flying in with the king. King b2, rook to a8. Once again, Gukesh threatening checkmate, this time with the move queen to a1. And here Arjun, he defends by giving a series of checks against the black king. All right, queen d5, king to f8, queen c5, king g8. And we're going to fast forward just a little bit here up until this position right here. Here Arjun Erigaisi, he does go bishop to a6, finally blocking the attacks with the bishop. Now queen to a1 is not a threat, as the rook does not control the a1 square. However, Gukesh, queen to e4, flying in with the king, potentially threatening queen d4 ideas. Now Arjun, queen g5, king to f8, queen c5, king g8, queen g5, king f8, queen to f6. No more checks. Now Gukesh, queen to h1, once again flying back with the queen. And again, we're going to fast forward just a little bit here, a few more moves, both sides giving lots of checks, running with their king. And then here in this position, queen to b7 on the board. Arjun Erigaisi forcing the queens off the board. He has no checks against the white king, and the rook on a8 is undefended unless you take on b7 immediately. So with that in mind, queen takes b7 on the board, then bishop takes, then rook to b8, and finally bishop to f3. And in this position, once again, according to the eval bar, this game is dead even. Arjun Erigaisi having the bishop and the 2 extra pawns on the queen side versus the rook of Gukesh. And it is literally anyone's game. Anything can happen from here. All right, f5 on the board. Gukesh knows he needs to push that pawn down the board, and he has to do it fast. But Arjun Erigaisi, he knows the same. c4 expanding on the queen side. Now king f7, king c3, both sides activating their kings. King to f6, b4 on the board. Arjun with those 2 connected pawns on the queen side, those are dangerous. All right, rook g8 on the board, threatening rook to g3, and that would win the bishop on the spot, as the bishop would be pinned, and there is no way to defend. So with that in mind, king d4. So now in response to rook g3, the bishop can move anywhere it wants. So rook g3 on the board, then bishop d5, and f4. Gukesh pushing his pawn down the board as fast as he can. Is Arjun going to be able to stop it? Let's find out. b5 on the board, both sides going for it. And here, Gukesh, his best idea is going to be rook to b3, putting the rook where it belongs, behind the passed pawn. Instead, he does go king to e7, trying to defend with his king, but this turns out to be a fatal mistake. Here Arjun, he doesn't let up. b6 on the board, king d8, then c5, pushing both those pawns. Now Gukesh, f3 on the board, king to e3, f2, king takes f2, now rook d3, pressuring the bishop. Gukesh lost his pawn, and now it's up to Arjun to find a way to win with those 3 extra pawns and the bishop versus the rook. All right, bishop f3 defends the bishop. And then Gukesh finally putting the rook where it belongs, behind the passed pawn on the b3 square. Rook b3 on the board. The idea being, if Arjun goes b7, then rook takes b7 could be a move. And if c5, the b6 pawn would hang. However, here Arjun, he sees into the future. He steps into his time machine, and he knows you can actually go b7 in this position. The idea being if rook takes b7, then c6, followed by c7 and c8 would decide the game on the spot. Therefore, rook takes b7 is not a move. Instead, king c7 on the board, and now h5. Arjun pushing pawns all over the board. All right, rook b4 on the board for Gukesh. King g3, rook d4, c6. Those pawns on the queen side now both being defended by the bishop. Now the action will be on the king side. All right, rook d8, defending along the back rank. Bishop e4, guarding that h7 square with the bishop. Rook g8, king f4, rook f8, king g5, rook to f1, putting the rook once again where it belongs, on the back rank behind the pawn, potentially. Now h6, rook g1, hitting the king, king to h5, rook g3, setting up rook to h3 ideas, trying to defend. But here Arjun Erigaisi, he just goes h7, and here in this position, Gukesh, he knows when he's beat. Even rook to h3 won't save the game after, say, king to g6. That king will escort the pawn down the board, and for that reason here, Gukesh D resigns on the spot to Arjun Erigaisi. Wow, what a game between Arjun and Gukesh here. Alright, Chess YouTube, if you enjoyed this video and if you love Indian chess players, go and smash that like button. Thank you so much for doing that. And while you're at it, check out this video right here, where Magnus Carlsen himself shocks Gukesh with a nuclear rook sacrifice in the opening. That game was incredible. I'm sure you're going to love it, so check it out. And I'll see you in the next video.